So, mercury and fish. Since 2006, the Sierra Fund has worked to address the legacy impacts of the gold rush on the Sierra Nevada. And as part of this, we've developed a suite of projects that specifically look to reduce public exposure to legacy toxics. And mercury in fish is one of those legacy toxics that is associated with the gold rush. So as with all of our work, we start within the historic context of the California Gold Rush because we really see the gold rush as being sort of the seminal event that impacted the resiliency of both the ecosystems and the communities of the Sierra Nevada. So we see those impacts not just in terms of impacts on the mines themselves, so around those hydraulic and hard rock mines, but we see impacts to the meadows by the miners that came to the area and were looking for ways to feed themselves. So meadows were appropriated to graze cattle and other livestock. We see impacts to resiliency in terms of the forests, which were clear cut to build the towns around the mines and to timber the mines and fuel the stamp mills. We see impacts to the fish of the Sierra Nevada region, where vibrant anadromous fish populations had their passage to their upper natal spawning grounds blocked by major dams on mainstream rivers, many of which were initially put in place during the gold rush in order to supply water to the mines. And then finally, we see impacts to the people of the Sierra Nevada. And we both look at that in terms of, during the gold rush, impacts on our First Nations, who were disenfranchised, removed from the land, and exterminated. But the impacts of the gold rush on people actually extend all the way into the present day in terms of these legacy health impacts on rural communities of the Sierra Nevada and impacts to the ability of these rural communities to actually address the legacy toxins. So there's limited capacity in these headwater communities where the impacts are most persistent. Our mission works to address kind of all of these impacts rolled into one to restore ecosystem and community resiliency in the Sierra Nevada region. We don't really feel like you can disconnect ecosystem resiliency from community resiliency because these are places where people live and work and raise families and are there for generations. We have 3 programs that serve our mission. We have our Ecosystem Resiliency Program, our Environmentally Healthy Communities Program, and our Capacity Building Program. Today, we're going to be talking about projects within environmentally healthy communities. So our Environmentally Healthy Communities Program has 4 different components: mercury and fish, obviously the topic of today's discussion, but we also look at dusty exposures associated with legacy mine sites, water quality and water access, and air quality and wildfire, as those are linked back to legacy impacts on our forests dating from the gold rush. Because all of our projects are sort of bundled together in that we see the ecosystems, the communities to be so connected, it is no surprise that mercury exposure also has a place in our ecosystem resiliency program, specifically within our Headwater Mercury Source Reduction Strategy project, where mercury exposure is one of 4 strategic targets for addressing mercury in the headwaters. So why all the focus on mercury? Well, essentially, mercury was imported to the Sierra Nevada for use in gold mining. Though it does occur naturally in very small amounts in the Sierra Nevada, it doesn't occur abundantly. So when we think about mercury in connection to the gold rush, we're really thinking about this material being imported for use in gold processing, and leaving a lasting legacy on the landscape at these mine sites. And then because these mine sites are continuously eroding and emitting runoff during storm events, we're seeing these impacts from the mercury at the mine sites and our rivers and streams all the way downstream to the Bay Delta. So in the gold here, you're looking at basically the primary gold mining region of the headwaters. The gold is where all the gold mines were. And then in the red, you're seeing the mercury mines. So the mercury mines in the Coast Range is where all of that gold was imported from to the Sierra Nevada. And as I mentioned, as a result of use in the Sierra Nevada, we see really contaminated watersheds. So across the Sierra Nevada, some of the most contaminated watersheds are actually right in the backyard of the Sierra Fund, the South Yuba River and Bear watersheds, as well as the American River watershed. So why are we concerned with mercury in watersheds? Well, mercury was used as an amalgam in gold mining. So essentially elemental mercury that was imported from the Coast Range binds with gold. So it helped to improve recovery, in particular at hydraulic mines like Malakoff Diggings, where you had miners trying to capture very fine gold from these very fine silts and clays that were deposited in these ancient riverbeds. And mercury was really, really useful in pulling that fine grained gold out of that fine sediment material. It was also used at hard rock mines where the stamp mills were crushing that ore brought up from underground, and then mercury was then used for the same reason, to remove that fine crushed gold from the not as useful mill sands or remaining dust. So 26 million pounds about of mercury were used during the gold rush, and of that about 10 to 13 million pounds are lost. And by that, what we mean is that's approximately the amount of mercury that during mining operations essentially washed out of these mines, washed away from these stamp mills, was left entrained in sediment at these hydraulic mine sites. And this is really problematic because the primary pathway of human exposure to mercury is the consumption of contaminated fish. And when we have this elemental mercury getting into these aquatic ecosystems, these rivers and streams, that mercury can actually convert, methylate from that elemental form into a bioavailable form, which is really problematic because what that means is that it can enter the food web and then both biomagnify and bioaccumulate as you move up through the food web. So when we think about biomagnification and bioaccumulation, we're often thinking about reservoirs that are downstream of hydraulic mine sites. That's because we know that mercury is transported off of these mine sites bound to the fine silts and clays during storm events. And when it washes downstream into these reservoirs, it can become trapped behind the dams. And reservoirs tend to be low oxygen and they tend to be warm. And so these are conditions that lead to increased methylation potential or conversion of that elemental mercury into the bioavailable methyl mercury form. So once mercury has become bioavailable, it biomagnifies at each step that it moves up in the food web. So you start with an example magnification of 100,000 times between water and algae. And then depending on the unique dynamics of a given aquatic ecosystem, you're going to see a 2 to 5 time magnification at each point you move up in trophic position. So by the time you get to a predatory fish that's consuming prey fish, that are consuming benthic macroinvertebrates, that are consuming algae, you're talking about the potential for very high levels of mercury accumulation. So in addition to this biomagnification, bioaccumulation is taking place as well. And that's essentially the idea that you have mercury accumulating within an individual. So if you have a long-lived predatory species like a black bass that's at the top of the food web and is thus subject to the biomagnification factor, and they're also eating lots of prey fish from directly below them on the food web, you're going to typically see very high levels of mercury. So specifically where the Sierra Fund works, the issue of exposure. How did we come to this place where we are so concerned about the issue of exposure? So this map that you're looking is of the Cosumnes American Bear Yuba watershed region. So it's got the Bear River, the South Yuba River, and the American River. The ones that I mentioned are especially contaminated. And you're looking at red dots, which represent mines across that region. You're seeing some water bodies that are more turquoise. That means they're listed under the Clean Water Act Section 303D as impaired for mercury. And we know that there's a lot of people fishing at these water bodies. And we also know that there's not a lot of understanding of potential exposure risk. There's fairly limited data on exposure risk and also in terms of individual water bodies, the amount of mercury that's potentially in these local fish. And there's not a lot of site-specific fish consumption advisories. So that leads us to, how do we reduce exposure risk? If we have all these mines that we know are contributing mercury to these water bodies, and we know that people are fishing, and we know that there's an exposure potential to these fish, and particularly predatory, upper trophic level species, how do we reduce exposure risk? So the first thing we kind of came to was that we need more information about local anglers. It is so important to understand who is catching fish, where they're catching it. And then with that information, if you're understanding those components and what they're catching, then you can better design research projects that are actually going to collect the data that will allow for an analysis of exposure risk. If we have more fish tissue data, then there's the potential for the development of more site-specific fish advisories or healthy eating guidelines that give folks fishing an idea of which fish are safe to consume, by whom, and in what quantity. And so site-specific advisories essentially can make more information accessible, in particular with the new legislation, which I'll discuss at the end, AB 762. Site-specific advisories are really key to getting this information out into the world. And the hope is that if you have increased access to information, you're going to have decreased exposure risk, because people are going to be able to use that information to protect their health. So they're going to know which species of fish are safe to consume, from what water body, and by whom. And the by whom is really important because women and children are particularly sensitive to the exposure impacts of mercury, and I'll get to that in a moment. The Sierra Fund approaches all of our work with this strategic arc, and I've sort of been dancing around our strategic arc in this lead up, but essentially we start all of our work with this 360-degree understanding on the ground. And so with angler surveys, where we're trying to figure out catch and consumption patterns, we're trying to get that 360-degree understanding. Are people fishing these water bodies? Are they only fishing for trout? Or are they also consuming fish that we know to be high in mercury? So we've engaged problem solvers on this issue, both through our Ecosystem Resiliency Program and our Headwater Mercury Source Reduction Technical Advisory Committee, or HMSR TAC. And we also engage with problem solvers downstream of us, such as with the Delta Exposure Mercury Exposure Reduction Program. So our partners downstream at Delta MERP, who also do a lot of work related to exposure to mercury. We have pilot projects in terms of actually collecting the data that is needed to help people make healthy choices about mercury in fish. So our CABY fish tissue sampling and analysis protocol, and our data collection project, our angler survey. And we also try to know better and do better when we have this information. So one thing we found with our angler survey is that fish advisories, even if they were available for water bodies, weren't being posted. So with our annual Post-it Day event, we're knowing better, doing better, because we know that water bodies aren't being posted. And so we're going out there every year and making sure those advisories are posted at water bodies so people have access to information. And then finally, we are trying to sustain the change by expanding our fish consumption advisory posting protocol to other regions, and by using it as a tool to help folks with the new AB 762 implementation, which is going to require the posting of site-specific fish advisories at water bodies where they apply statewide. So to dig a bit into a couple of our projects, data collection and public education. So one of our projects, as I mentioned, was the angler survey. We started that project in 2009, collecting 150 surveys from anglers on the ground, trying to get that on the ground understanding of the issue, because we had heard from many stakeholders downstream that people were under the impression that because advisories were widely posted in the Delta, but not in the Sierra Nevada, that people just aren't fishing up here or catching and consuming the fish. They're mostly catch and release fishermen, and they're mostly catching trout. Those types of assumptions. And, you know, you can really only dispel assumptions by collecting adequate data to assess the situation. And so we worked to collect 150 surveys in 2009, and then we actually increased the number of surveys that we had by an additional 224 surveys, so that way we've subsequently been able to expand that data set and really get an understanding across, you know, a 5-year time frame, what's going on with anglers that are water bodies. Our other project, fish tissue data collection, we collected fish tissue data from 8 locations in the CABY region using a protocol that was approved by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And the point there was to collect data that could be used by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or a WEHA, to develop site-specific fish consumption advisories. For our angler survey research, we really found it important to replicate previous survey research conducted in the Bay Delta, because by using a survey that had been used elsewhere, developed by UC Davis and the California Department of Public Health, with a survey protocol developed by UC Davis and the Healthy Fish Coalition, we were essentially creating a data set that could be compared to previous research done downstream in the Bay Delta. So what did we find from our Gold Country Angler Survey? Well, we found that, locally species being consumed were essentially what was available in these water bodies. But in some cases, we did find exception. We had assumed that people, for instance, were not consuming carp or pike minnow from water bodies. And through our on-the-ground research, we discovered that actually, yes, some population groups, specifically Russian and Ukrainian populations, do consume carp and pike minnow from our local water bodies. But on the whole, we saw rainbow trout, brown trout, catfish, bullhead, sunfish, and bass. We did find that nearly half of anglers are consuming their catch, and of those who are consuming their catch, 36% are also feeding it to their children, and to women of childbearing age, and to women who are pregnant and nursing. Another component that we have added to our suite of Mercury and fish projects is the posting of advisories. As I mentioned, this is an annual event that we hold to post advisories in our region. It came out of that on-the-ground research that indicated that advisories are not actually posted at water bodies, even if they're available. Our inaugural event was held in 2015, and sort of every year since then, we've added a layer onto that event. So the following year in 2016, we specifically targeted families because of mercury being a developmental neurotoxin. Women and children and infants are most susceptible to the impacts of mercury exposure. The impacts can include ADHD and slow development of fine motor skills. So in 2016, we felt like it was really important to target those sensitive populations with our information around fish advisories and healthy eating guidelines. In 2017, we posted advisories for Spanish for the first time, because in our region, the greatest percentage of minority population are our Spanish speakers, and we really wanted to make sure that that information was accessible, to everyone who might be out fishing. In 2018, we posted permanent signage at select locations. In 2019, we were really excited that the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment had issued new fish advisories to stream and river segments in our region. And I should say reissued advisories, because fish advisories existed for the Bear River, the Yuba River, and Deer Creek for our region until a WEHA updated their data requirements, their standards for data in terms of the number of samples they required. In 2009, and when they did that, many existing advisories were actually discontinued or deemed to be not sufficiently strong in terms of the amount of data supporting them. And so we were really excited in 2019 when many of these advisories that had sort of been retracted were then reissued with sufficient data. And so now we're really excited in 2019 that we are going to be working to support local water body managers in implementing AB 762. And how can we assist in that process, since it's now a requirement statewide? And how can we use what we've learned through our posted day efforts to make it really streamlined so that everyone can leverage our best practices that we've learned from doing this, going on 6 years? So components of fish consumption advisories, there's three components, a population group because of that developmental sensitivity. So women under the age of 49 or considered childbearing age, and then children under the age of 18 are considered a sensitive population, while women over 49, so 50 and above, and then men over 18 are not considered as sensitive. And that is because of that developmental sensitivity. So when fish advisories are developed, two sets of guidelines are developed, one for a sensitive group and one for the less sensitive group. Fish advisories are developed for a specific species of fish. So I mentioned that some advisories had been dropped previously because there wasn't sufficient data. Usually a WIHA requires 9 or more samples for a given species of fish from a water body in order to issue advice. And those come together in a frequency of consumption. So if it's a high mercury fish, and you're a woman or a child, your frequency of consumption could be do not eat at all, or it might be consume 1 meal a week. Whereas for a non-sensitive population group, that frequency of consumption would allow for greater rates of consumption. And this just kind of explains that a bit in a different way. You know, you have different fish that have different diets. So if you have a rainbow trout that's an omnivore and they're eating lots of benthic macroinvertebrates, but not eating very high in the food web, they're going to typically have a lower level of mercury in their tissue than an upper trophic level fish like a bass that is long-lived and it's at the top of the food web. This gives you just a sense of the geographic locations where both the angler survey and the fish tissue research were conducted, as well as the areas that we've posted with advisories. And the overlap of all three of these projects has really helped us both understand the issue and understand how we can better reduce exposure in our region. So one of the things we did with our angler survey is that we really wanted to better understand if we're out there posting these advisories as part of our annual posted day effort, is that enough? Is it actually providing information to people who are fishing in a way that allows them to use that information meaningfully and actually make healthy fish consumption choices? Because you can put information out there, but if people don't understand how to use it, the information is really not serving its purpose. So we coupled our angler surveys with our posted day effort, and we went out and conducted surveys after water bodies in our region had been posted in 2015, after that initial posting effort, because we wanted to understand whether, if the advisories were posted, did people see them? And were they able to articulate information about the three components contained in an advisory? So what population group they were in, what species of fish they were consuming, and how often they could consume the fish. Because you really have to understand all three of those components in order to make a healthy eating choice. And you know, what we found out was, yes, people do see fish consumption advisories, so they have seen or heard of fish warnings, which is excellent. That means people are paying attention, and when they are out fishing, they have, you know, a vague sense of awareness that there is information that should direct how they consume fish or maybe warn them away from certain species. So unfortunately, though people had by and large seen and heard these fish warnings, you know, 12% could not accurately recall the warning, which means that they couldn't say anything about any of the issues associated with the fish consumption advisory. 56% had some level of awareness. So that means that people who were surveyed might be able to say something along the lines of, oh, there's fish advisories, and it means that some fish are bad to eat. Okay. 24% of people surveyed could articulate information on one issue. So they could say it's about not eating black bass, or it's about women eating less than men, or things like that. Only 7% of anglers surveyed could articulate information on two issues. So could say, my child should not eat black bass. And only 1% of people surveyed could articulate information on three issues. So what this tells us is that although people are aware of the need to follow healthy eating guidelines, they really are not getting the information in a format that's helping them make a choice, or they're not being exposed to the information frequently enough. They're seen at some water bodies and not others. A number of factors could be coming into play here. But this tells us that our work is not done in terms of helping people make healthy eating choices about fish. So this is some of the fish tissue data that the Sierra Fund collected through our fish tissue research project in the CABY region, as well as some data that are available on the California Environmental Data Exchange Network and data that were taken from fish advisories that have been developed by OEHA. Now, this is meant to be purely an illustrative slide because not all of the data included in this slide have been vetted by OEHA and actually used to develop an idea. But this gives you sort of a takeaway, which is that when you're seeing a square in red, that means that that species of fish for that water body is designated as a do not eat, or would be if there were an advisory based on the fish tissue mercury levels for sensitive population groups. And if you're seeing a square in green, that means that that species of fish at that water body represents a healthy eating choice for a sensitive population group. And so what you're taking away here is that for most water bodies in that first column where we're looking at black bass are listed as do not eat for sensitive populations. And in contrast, if we're looking at rainbow trout, we're seeing that for most water bodies, rainbow trout would be considered a healthy eating choice. And if we're seeing a blue square, that means that there are no data available. So OEHA would not be able to develop healthy eating guidelines for that particular species of fish at that water body. So what types of actions can we take with all of this information around these different projects? Well, we've collected angler survey data from our region. We regularly engage with folks managing water bodies in other regions, for instance, Santa Clara Valley Water District, where they collect angler surveys as well to help inform their posting of advisories. The Delta Mercury Exposure Reduction Program has been using some abbreviated options from the angler survey that we use in the Gold Country to evaluate whether posting advisories in the Delta is an effective way to convey information. We've collected regional fish tissue data, but in a moment when I discuss AB 762, we'll identify that there's a real need for more fish tissue data from specific water bodies. We've used our angler survey and fish tissue data to identify water bodies with a high risk of exposure, which in the Sierra Nevada region is almost all of our water bodies, because the black bass typically are very high in mercury, where there are site-specific advisories issued for water bodies. So advisories that are developed using data collected from that specific water body, and those healthy eating guidelines then only apply to that water body. We also know that if there's not site-specific advice and it's a lake or reservoir, then the statewide advisory for lakes and reservoirs should apply, and that statewide advisory also lists black bass as a do not eat species for sensitive populations. We've posted state-issued fish consumption advisories at water bodies since 2015. As I mentioned, this will be our 6th year posting. And now we're really working to use all this information to inform our targeted outreach and regulatory action. And we are really excited that last year we had the opportunity to engage with Assemblymember Quirk and his staff as they worked to develop the language for AB 762, which is legislation that was signed into law earlier this year. And AB 762 requires the posting of site-specific fish consumption advisories statewide. So the posting of those fish consumption advisories that have been developed for water bodies that have enough data for that specific water body for there to be specific healthy eating guidelines. And we're really excited about this because this means that statewide there's going to be a lot more consistency in the frequency and abundance with which fish consumption advisories are visible and available to the public. This legislation does place the responsibility for ensuring that posting occurs on local public health officers. And it places the responsibility for enforcing once the advisories are posted, that they remain posted also on local public health officers. Here in Nevada County, we're really fortunate because we've had a long-standing relationship with our environmental health department. They've supported our posted day efforts since the beginning. But we're very aware that in other counties in the rural headwaters, not all environmental health departments will have the same capacity to ensure that these advisories are being posted and to enforce that. So some questions that have come up for us is we're working to support AB 762 implementation is we really feel like in addition to site-specific advisories, the statewide advisory, if there's one that applies. So there are statewide advisories for lakes and reservoirs without site-specific advice, for coastal locations without site-specific advice, and for fish that migrate. So if there is a statewide advisory that can be used for a water body in place of a site-specific advisory, we're really advocating that that gets posted, because we don't want to continue to perpetuate the myth that if a water body is not posted, it means that the fish are safe to consume, or that all species of fish are safe to consume. Because we know that's not necessarily true, but it does sort of imply that in many cases to the public, if suddenly we are seeing a lot more fish advisories posted and people are not understanding the larger discourse around this and the data requirements, in that where advisories are posted isn't necessarily representative of where fish are contaminated, but rather where there are data available for those advisories to be developed. So essentially, as I said, we're advocating that both site-specific and statewide advisories be posted as part of AB 762 implementation. We're advocating that site-specific advisories be posted with permanent signage where economically feasible. The permanent signage lasts a lot longer. It's you can place it more prominently because it's typically larger. You know, you're investing in a sign versus putting up a laminated poster that may fall off of where you've posted it. And then we're advocating that these site-specific advisories be posted until, the statewide advisories be posted until site-specific advice is developed. In addition, you know, we're really hoping to support folks who are water body managers or are in some way engaged on the Mercury issue. We're hoping people will advocate for the collection of additional fish tissue data so that more site-specific advisories can be developed, in particular for water bodies that we know are impaired for mercury under Clean Water Act Section 303D, or are on, you know, the statewide reservoir total mercury or total maximum daily load for mercury in the statewide mercury program. We're just hoping that this can be used as a way to incentivize the data collection that will allow all water bodies in the state to be posted with advice that is relevant and applicable to the fish that folks are consuming from it. So I had this all queued up on my other computer. And I'm going to try to do this right now. But there's a couple of things I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you all OEHA's website where all the fish consumption advisories that they've issued live, in case anyone's not clear how to access that information. And then I also really wanted to reiterate that even though the advisories are being posted, risk communication strategies are still needed. Not all communities understand and use information in the same way. The way information is conveyed on a fish consumption advisory may not be intuitive to all communities and all population groups. So the work is not done. It's really important to continue to ensure that appropriate risk communication is taking place. So I'm going to quickly run through the rest of these slides and then see if I can pull up both OEHA's fish advisory site, and then the Sierra Fund created a video a few years ago that just in a very simplistic way tries to show people when they're looking at a fish advisory, what's the information you should be looking for. And if I can get those to pull up in a timely way, I will show you. But as always, we really want to thank our project funders. For this particular suite of projects, the support has been, you know, decades in the making. Clarence E. Heller Charitable Foundation, True North, NEED, Cali, PA, Department of Water Resources, Nevada Irrigation District, and the Rose Foundation for Community and the Environment, which I'm noticing is not on this slide, and that is clearly because I made last minute changes to the slide deck that was on the other computer. And yeah, we are always looking forward to hearing more information from folks both working on mercury and fish and who are interested in supporting our work by volunteering for, some of our post-to-date efforts over the years. We've, always been grateful for all the supporters around that work, and we encourage you to ask many questions.